Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to our third session with the Book of Illuminations. I'm so excited. The first two have been absolutely amazing and incredible. I want to start off as usual by calling attention to yesterday's incredible khutbah, as always. The title of it is, Do We Offer a Car or a Camel? And the Racism of Human Rights. And it's a really, it was a long, really powerful khutbah. The idea about do we offer a car or a camel is the idea that context matters. What we offer as Islam matters in terms of how it relates to our time and how it's relevant to the issues that we face in our, in 2023. We talk about this a lot of the time. But just to kind of hammer it home, Sheikh spent a lot of time giving us a very powerful analogy. It's, if you live in a world where people need a car, but you insist on offering them a camel, then you really are not meeting the challenges of the day. And that is unfortunately what really happens in so many Islamic spaces, but also among Muslims when it comes to Islam. And he was just saying that this is really a condition that is across every single field, every single spectrum, every single issue when it comes to people starting to talk about Islam and what this faith calls for. But you would never see this happen among Muslims who are doctors or engineers or lawyers. You're not going to see doctors offering honey and olive oil as a solution to really complex issues, because that's not what is needed, although, today, although that might have been the right solution, the best solution back 1,400 years ago. But, there's so many different examples of how this plays out in our world. And he also then talked about the example of a man named Ben Robert Smith, who is in Australia. He's effectively a war hero, but recently it has come out that he has committed all kinds of horrific human rights violations in Afghanistan, and was tracked down by two very moral and ethical and dogged journalists who really were just going after the truth, and supported by a lawyer who brought a lawsuit against this person. And interestingly, on the flip side, Ben Robert Smith was able to get a very wealthy donor to contribute $16 million in his defense for this lawsuit. And just, when you see stories like this, how painful it is when you bring it to our reality as Muslims and where we stand in the world. And it was an important segue into the issue of human rights and how human rights is a field, again, building on the theme from last week about how human rights is the secular religion of our age. And so much of this discussion about the world and where things stand plays out in the human rights field. And where within that, Muslims are really at the bottom of the barrel, both in terms of where they are situated and also in terms of the representation. We are effectively, people like, for example, Israel get a pass on everything despite all of the human rights violations they commit. But Muslims are pretty much on par with anyone else who's dark-skinned, with the black population when it comes to how they are treated on the flip side of it. And one of the really interesting articles that I know that Sheikh drew on was a piece that came out in Foreign Policy. It was something that actually we found reported on Democracy Now!, where the most horrific wars are not reported on in the media. And that is also, an indication of where we are in terms of, how racist human rights as a field is. But it was a really important issue because, this is one of these opportunities where, when we go back to this theme that Sheikh has really been developing over the last several khutbahs, this idea of individual excellence, and how when we as Muslims live in this age, where it is really impossible for us as individuals to, address or tackle or overcome the issues of like how much money the Saudis have, how much money the UAE has, the whole power structure that exists in the world, that really, since we can't really make any ground or headway in fighting that big battle. I mean, the odds are just stacked against us as individuals. The only real thing that makes sense is to turn inward and to really focus on our individual excellence and representing the Ummah in that way. And so when you apply that as a methodology or as, an approach to trying to change the world, human rights as a field is ripe for excellence. So, for, like, I know, Mito was sitting and listening to this, and I was thinking to myself, oh my, as he's thinking about his career choices and going to college, I hope this was something that was really inspiring, because we really need help on the human rights front. We need really smart, really good people to represent and then come forward as Muslims and say, this is what needs to happen to move us forward as a people. And, it's, we sort of also had a little talk after the khutbah, which was interesting, is, this whole idea of individual excellence applies also for Muslim organizations as they exist today, because, Muslim organizations are often not in the conversation, they're not relevant, they're not at the forefront of anything. And a lot of it is because what we learn from other organizations that are at the top of their game, it's an amalgamation of people who are already excellent in and of themselves. And so you have a lot of individuals who are excellent, they come together, they build really excellent institutions. And so for us, in the situation we're in, it makes a lot of sense for us as individuals to even, do extremely well in those institutions that have already been built, take control of those, reach a critical mass, and then, maybe if we're not good institution builders as Muslims today, we can definitely do well within institutions that have already been built and, try and make some progress that way. So there's, again, these khutbahs are so valuable, they're so thought-provoking, and they really bring together discipline and thought across so many different fields. And so I hope, and I'm always so encouraged when people write and they, and we always get messages from people about how these khutbahs or these halakas make such a difference for people in our world. And so I hope that, you will continue, people will continue to spread the word about what goes on here and what we talk about. And in that light, I thought I would just kind of share something that I thought was interesting. Is this week, just as as an example, we got like 3 emails from individuals that were writing because they were really troubled about the things that they're seeing out in the world when it comes to Islam. And these are like, obviously they're just random people from different parts of the world, but they all came together and they literally threw like a laundry list of questions to Sheikh about, slavery, about the place of women, concubinage, zinna, and all of this like ugly stuff that is out there in the media. And, like one message came sort of angry. It was like, someone told me to contact you. Here are my questions about Islamic law. Thank you very much. And it was like literally 10 questions and they were very detailed. Another one was like, well, I want to know about, homosexuality. I know you've talked about that. And again, I want to know about this issue and that issue and that issue. And, and then a third one was actually very polite, but again, 3 pages worth of like detailed questions, thinking about whatever, and expecting that Sheikh could, literally take the time to answer each of these questions. And so, for one of these, oftentimes I'm kind of the bad guy, I'm kind of the gatekeeper, and I feel like, I have to push back. And so one of the people that I wrote back is I said, thank you so much for your email, but we just, Sheikh just spent 3 years going through the Quran, chapter by chapter, talking about a lot of things, addressing these exact issues that exact questions that you have raised. And, some of these people take the time to say, this is something I've been struggling with for years. It's something that really shakes my faith. It's something that I've been contemplating, and no one else is talking about this. So please, I'm hoping that Usuli can talk about it because other people are not willing to talk about it. Well, my answer has to be, look, we have spent 3 years covering these issues. These are very important questions, but you have to take the time, out of respect, to do your homework, do the due diligence. When Sheikh has invested a lifetime, studying all of this, and then arrives here and for 3 years really shares everything that you need to know, answers these very same questions, talks about all of these hadith that people raise, and ask him really to say, well, explain this, and this. I pushed back and I said, listen, I can tell from your questions that you haven't watched the tafsir. And, you really, we covered a lot of these things with a lot of depth, a lot of clarity. Please go back and take a look at that before I share your email with Sheikh. It's not really fair that, after he's answered so many of these questions, that he would have to do this again. And so the least that you can do is, engage his material, see how much you can answer on your own, and then if that's still an issue, fine, then I feel free to speak to me about it. But also, he addressed this in yesterday's khutbah as well, which is that a lot of people come and sort of throw at him questions that have nothing to do with their own reality of their situation. They, want to know, well, my faith is struggling because in Islam, women can or cannot get divorced based on this, that, or the other thing. And it obviously, it's not a question that pertains to that particular person, and it requires a lot of Islamic law expertise. And he addresses this issue. And again, it's like that, if your faith is resting on, some technicality of law, then that's the wrong engagement. And so there's just, it's like there's so much now. We've been, spending so much time and creating so much content that is extremely valuable. It's literally a wellspring of enlightenment and beauty and knowledge. And so I really want to encourage people, it's a matter of etiquette as well. We have one sheikh who we all love and, trust and really want to share his knowledge with us. And, I try to push back to let people know that, it's a very critical resource. We have one sheikh with a limited amount of time and energy. And so when we demand, that sheikh to answer 3 pages of questions for us to satisfy something, we're asking for him to take time away from producing really valuable content for the entire ummah that can be drawn upon for future generations. And so there's enough out there for people to address these particular questions. So I just wanted to share that because I know sometimes people expect that sheikhs should just be able to answer questions and respond to emails, and we get so many. So I apologize that we can't get to everything. It's simply impossible. But also to engage our content, take the time. If you've spent 2 years struggling over something that has been causing problems in your faith, you could have spent that 2 years engaging with us with the Quran as we did the tafsir. And it's an incredible investment of your time and energy. It's more than worth it. So anyway, so that's it. And now that we've done the tafsir, now we're on to the book of Illuminations, which is so beautiful in terms of like how to then take this and engage in our lives even further. So this is, I hope everyone will just spread the word and take the time really to invest in the knowledge. So thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here again for another session, and thank you for joining us.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. Before we continue on with Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya, I mean, see the journey with a text like Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya as I mentioned earlier, that journey at a central level, a very basic level, is about the adab, the ethics of building a relationship with Allah. And this has been something, it's very, very common in the Muslim community where people have a list of questions that either have to do with Islamic law or have to do with Islamic history or have to do with the seerah. What happened in this battle and what happened with the issue of concubines or enslavement at war and things like that. And they demand a response. Now, of course, the psychological dynamics here are fascinating. On the one hand, I've received many messages like this in the past, And I have very strong suspicions that the messages are actually not by a Muslim at all, but by an Islamophobe. And they do this as a way of challenging you. And especially the ones that sound very angry. But even if they are indeed by Muslims and non-Islamophobes pretending to be Muslims, notice that this type of sociological dynamic where a person has a set of questions about historical events or a set of questions about legal issues, and these questions become an impediment to faith. And it's not just that they are an impediment to faith, but they are an impediment to identity. So their identity, their sense of being as a Muslim is undermined and greatly weakened because of questions that they think are very difficult to answer. And if you think of how often do you encounter the same dynamic in the world of Judaism or the world of Christianity? Although a real student of, you could have the same flood of questions about any tradition. It depends on what you're looking for, and what type of data were you exposed to. Especially if you don't have mastery over the mechanics of data. It is far more common in the Islamic context, and then it is. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that because we are a defeated people, because we are a people whose law and whose theology and whose history is colonized, thoroughly colonized, even the questions that we ask about our tradition are not our own. And what is the word I'm looking for? Not arrogance, but beyond arrogance, something between arrogance and insolence. The presumptuousness, maybe, that we feel comfortable in demanding responses to intellectual issues that are far beyond what we are positioned to actually investigate or research or study. The reductionism by which we deal with the Islamic tradition, it takes a great deal of presumptuousness. It takes a great deal of arrogance. How do you get this arrogant attitude towards a tradition? You get that arrogant attitude towards a tradition if you are conditioned to see this tradition in a diminutive fashion. So if you are conditioned, for instance, to think of the Jewish tradition and think to yourself, oh, well, Jewish history is very complicated, and there is a lot of scholarship out there, and I cannot really ask a question without, it's sort of, you are conditioned to think in terms of, if I have a question about Jewish history, or I have a question about Jewish law, I don't dare speculate about anything unless I deal with the enormous corpus of intellectual production within the Jewish tradition about these questions. So what you're conditioned to do is a level of humility and a level of intellectual refrain and intellectual restraint, because you are conditioned to think about a tradition as complicated, nuanced, layered, and so the whole dynamic of pop questions and pop answers it's something that you don't even get into, you don't fall into, because of the fact that you are conditioned of thinking of a tradition as complicated and conditioned to have a level of humility vis-a-vis that tradition. In colonized traditions, there is a reductionism. People are not conditioned to think that that tradition is complex or nuanced or multi-layered or multifaceted, but in fact are conditioned to think that this is a tradition of a simplistic people who produce simplistic questions, who engage in simplistic historical dynamics. That stereotyping of a tradition is quintessentially what a colonized tradition becomes. You dumb down. So questions of law, by their very nature, are extremely complex, because it's not God speaking that tells us, here is all the law, but you are talking about human interpreters that engaged in very complex dynamics to produce a discursive juristic tradition. Similarly, questions of history, even a question like what happened in the Battle of Hunain with the prisoners of war, profoundly complex questions that are not open to simplistic black and white responses. The fact that every average Muslim grows up thinking that they can pose easy questions about the seerah and receive easy answers about the seerah, or about anything in Islamic history, or about anything in Islamic law, is exactly the fingerprint of a colonized tradition. So these people, I mean, I dealt with part of this in the khutbah, but it is so critical, because it is one of the core messages that I want to leave before leaving this world, because I see it as a monumental intellectual issue, that the questions we ask, we have become conditioned through colonialism, through Islamophobia, through power dynamics, to think that we're being critical thinkers. We're being deep thinkers when we say something like, what happened in the Battle of Hunain? But the way we ask the question and the way we expect a response, black or white, in a dichotomous fashion, is actually evidence of anything but critical or analytical thinking. What we are, the theater of it is that we are being dumb, asking dumb questions, receiving dumb answers, and the entire dynamic of Islamicity becomes a dumb, thoroughly anti-intellectual dynamic. Core part of being a Muslim is having a sense of awe and humility as how grand and enormous and nuanced the tradition to which you belong is. That you have a sense of deep reverence about, I belong to a tradition in which any question I ask about Islamic law and any question I ask about Islamic history will require years and years and years of study. And having the humility of saying, and it should be. It's not, you don't feel cheated by that. In fact, you feel vindicated by that. But this is so far, you find this all the time among Jewish students of Jewish history or Jewish law. You find this all the time among serious students of Christian history. Canon law, people don't even ask questions about canon law anymore. I mean, except for a very small select group. But I've even found it among Hindu students or Buddhist students, the intuitive awareness that if I make a generalization about my own tradition, all I'm doing is I'm proving how ignorant I am. It is completely absent in the Islamic context. That awareness that if I generalize about the seerah, or if I just shoot off my mouth about what happened to the prisoners of war in the Battle of Hunayn, which we can talk about, it will take us about 6 hours to just ask the relevant questions, review the relevant sources of information, develop some type of methodology for discourse before we can start having a serious conversation just about that one simple issue. SubhanAllah, this is precisely where something like Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyah comes in. Because if we raised our children with the awareness that if you want to ask questions about history, then do your homework and understand that asking the intelligent, relevant question is in fact a truly challenging dynamic. Same thing about history or law. As a Muslim, your faith should be based on a personal relationship with your Maker and a spiritual, emotional relationship with God's speech, the Quran. Anything that has to be vetted through history or law is false faith. If your faith is contingent on getting answers to legal questions, or contingent on getting answers to historical questions, then indeed you have no faith. You think you do, but you have no faith. And I often feel, assuming that the people who are writing me, because I get so many of these all the time, assuming that in fact they're not Islamophobes pretending to be Muslims. I often feel if you know, if I would let go of caution, I often feel like I want to write these people and tell them your problem is not getting answers about a woman's nafaqah after divorce, or whether a woman must obey her husband, or can't leave the home without the approval of her husband, all these, or getting a response to what happened in the Battle of Hunayn, or what happened in this battle or that battle. And you know, these questions go in fads, by the way. It's like Islamophobes focus on something, and that becomes the issue for a while, and then they shift to another question, and that becomes the issue for a while. You know, if you would let go of caution, you would just simply respond. You need to revisit the whole entire faith, your iman, whether in fact you, if you truly believe in God, and if you truly have any relationship to God, regardless of how evolved that relationship, but any relationship of God, that relationship that relationship supersedes any questions about history or law. And your relationship guides the way that you feel about questions of history and law. In other words, that intuitive knowledge and intuitive experience with your maker enables you to say, you know, I don't know what the answer, what the, you know, I might not have the time or the skill to delve into questions of law that I don't have answers for, or questions of history that I don't have answers for. But my relationship to Allah, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what it counsels me to do is to, what I've called in my writing, to engage in a conscientious pause. In other words, simply, I don't know, and maybe sometime in my life I will have the time to commit to studying these questions, but they're largely irrelevant to my relationship to Allah. If your relationship to Allah is mediated through law or history, that means your relationship to Allah is mediated through human institutions. You might be not intelligent enough or not educated enough to realize that law and history is a human product. But that's a separate matter. You might actually have bought, think that, well, all law comes from God and is part of sifat, the characteristics or the attributes of the divine, which is a entirely heretical idea. The sifat al-ilahiyya are not mirrored by any amount of legal interpretation. When we understand Allah through as-sifat, and we engage in a relationship with Allah through as-sifat, which we have begun talking about in Hikam al-Ata'iyya, we never approach the sifat through the understanding of Sharia. Because as we said, Sharia is not ilm al-haqiqa. Ilm al-Sharia itself is simply a human endeavor. Haqiqa, truth, is beyond Sharia. Going back now to the Hikam al-Ata'iyya, I mean, you notice immediately that just from what we talked about, and we've only covered so far five is that that if you begin this journey and think that you are going to reach Allah through Sharia or through Sirah, you will not get anywhere. These are not avenues to the divine. It is your relationship with the divine that will enable you to engage Sirah or Sharia in a moral, is ethically Islamic way, so that you have that awareness of what Sharia needs to do, what lessons to extract from Sirah, what sources in Sirah you can trust or not, on the basis of your relationship to Allah. It's not the other way around. And this is a huge all the major jurists that have become luminaries, Al-Ghazali or Al-Qarafi or Al-Shatibi or Al-Tusi, or the technocratic jurists, the jurists who were competent lawyers but offered nothing beyond competent thinking through the technicalities of law, are largely forgotten in Islamic history. All the big names that have become luminaries in the field, they were profoundly good Muslims before being good lawyers. And this is something critical for any student on this path to understand. That is why there are a number of Muslims out there who call themselves professors of Islamic law and who write on Islamic law without naming names. Some of them are technically competent, but woefully, Islamically, morally, ethically blind. They know the mechanics, but in terms of the quality of their Islam, it is horrible. And so in my book, I don't consider them Sharia experts. They're technocrats, but they're not Sharia experts, because Sharia, the word Sharia, is the path to God and from God. And if you don't understand anything about the God that is at the center of the dynamic, then you're a technocrat who, it's like a good lawyer that, for instance, a good tax lawyer or a good immigration lawyer who knows very little about constitutional law or American legal theory or American legal philosophy. They're a good technocrat. You go to them for very narrow issues. You need to file an application. You need to get relief to a problem. But you don't go to them for any deep questions about anything. They're simply not qualified. Notice, when I say this about American law, it makes sense to you. But we struggle for it to make sense when we speak about Islamic law. Therein is the proof of a colonized tradition. If you see it clearly when we deal with an example of American law, And you don't see it as clearly when we talk about the example of Islamic law. That's precisely because it's a colonized tradition and because your very intellect is also colonized. Like, you know, like all people who live under the shadow of racism, whether they encountered actual racial incidents or not, they cannot escape the fact that the institutions that govern their life, the economic structure that they labor under, this is especially among for Muslims in the West. This is a huge problem. Um, because our educational systems itself, I mean, the way that we teach Muslim kids to be Muslim is flawed. We offer them the law as if their relationship with God can be built on the law. And that's a fallacy. I mean, you know, you can teach someone the rules to fast Ramadan, but is that going to make them feel anything as they fast, anything other than just hunger and thirst? I mean, if you actually don't train them to experience fasting spiritually, how do you expect them to know how to turn fasting into a spiritual experience? But all our institutions, it's like, okay, when you fast, you're hungry, you're thirsty, alhamdulillah, objective achieved. And that is what makes us such easy prey to Islamophobia and colonialism and so on. So that a Muslim woman, I mean, it's mind-boggling. There are still Muslim women who have an actual relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are they still seriously asking, does my husband have the right to force me to have sex? If you have a real relationship with Allah, your spiritual awareness and consciousness of what compulsion means and what duress means, and why Allah condemns coercion and duress and sees it as fundamentally ugly, you wouldn't need to ask that question. You would know that whatever human institutions have produced that interpretation, you would know intuitively it cannot be. And you would be able to judge the law on the basis of your relationship with Allah. Because I can't feel a sense of my self-worth. I can't have a sense of a real relationship with Allah if my husband is raping me. But in this day and age, by the way, this is sort of like I told you that we keep having Islamophobic cyclical issues. So in this day and age, this is now becoming the cyclical. I'm getting all these questions suddenly by coincidence. Islamophobes start saying, oh yeah, in Islamic law, in Islam, men are allowed to rape their wives. And suddenly, all these Muslims start sending in questions. I'm having a crisis of faith because isn't it true that in Islamic law, husbands are allowed to rape their wives? And do I really need to give you a technical answer to that? Do I really need to go over all the schools of thought and who said what? And do you really not understand the role of patriarchy in history and the role of patriarchy in legal interpretation? Isn't your personal, intimate relationship with your Maker give you a sense of assurance and confidence as to what, and so that regardless of whatever ugly interpretation might have been given by whatever ugly human being hundreds of years ago, you tell yourself, I don't need to become an expert in Sharia law to make this, to marginalize this and put it aside, because it cannot be. The whole project of something like Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya is a failed project if you don't have that seriousness about a relationship with Allah. And many of us don't have a relationship with Allah because many of us, our iman is theoretical. So do we have actually yaqeen in knowing our God, in living with God every bit as real as a material reality? You live with your car. You can imagine your car. You get in your car every day. You drive your car. So many Muslims, their relationship to their car is far more real than their relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, contemplate this. Your relationship to your car is far more real and genuine and meaningful than your relationship to Allah. And our educational institutions that raise our Muslim children, it would be even considered sacrilegious to raise that issue in this fashion, which creates a bunch of people that are hypocritical about their faith. If they're not taught how to live with Allah as a full, genuine, real partner, at least every bit as real as their car, at least. Okay, well, it's not a tangent, it's more a foundational comment. But so much that just keeps reminding you that, there is a reason that books like Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya, and Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya is just one text. I mean, there is a reason we Muslims today, we generated a whole genre of this literature in droves at different points in our history. But Muslims today, I can't think of anyone who writes anything that is similar to that genre in our day and age. Okay, so the last hikmah that we dealt with is the al-basira, the insight in knowing when your jihad, ijtihad in this context means your diligence, your ijtihad in the sense of deliberate jihad. It doesn't mean the technical ijtihad in Sharia. But when your applied effort, your jihad, is called for, and when and under what types of circumstances and what types of issues you accept that something is fated. And notice that if you recall, it says, no, what is it? Oh, yeah. Striving after what has already offered to you here, اجتهادك فيما ضمن لك, it's not just offered to you, but it is striving after what has already been ضمن لك, what has already been guaranteed to you, meaning what has already been resolved and decided. So striving after what has already been resolved or decided, or juxtaposed to that, negligence in what is demanded of you. I would translate it as failing to strive after what is expected of you, what you have an affirmative obligation to strive after, is proof of lack of insight. So your ability to understand what you have, when you have an affirmative obligation for deliberate jihad, and what you accept with the humility of realizing that certain things are simply beyond your control and beyond your ijtihad, is that balance, is wisdom, is basira, as in the language of Sufis. Basira is the heart of perception and insight. And if you recall the example that we gave, which is an example often given in this literature, is when people respond or fail to respond to injustice and use qadar, use destiny, as an excuse to not discharge their obligation of al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, their obligation to and as we said, at a very minimum, while you accept, there are several steps as we will see, but while ultimately, when it comes to your own fate, your own issues, your own the trajectory of your own life, you can tell yourself, make that determination. I've done everything that I can, and now I leave the rest to Allah. I've done my jihad. I've done what the best that I can, and I leave then the results in Allah's hands, and I sincerely accept whatever Allah decides. That is entirely justified. But when the rights of other human beings is involved, the reason I'm hedging is that, as we will see, if you are not getting the results that you expected to get, you do have an obligation to think of, and as we'll talk about that in a little bit, whether this is a test, whether this is a punishment, or whether this is actually a blessing as well. So you go through that self-critical analysis, even at the individual level. But ultimately, when what is involved are your own personal rights, you are empowered to engage in this analysis and to ultimately surrender to this analysis. But when the rights of other human beings are involved, حق الغير, حقوق البشر generally, the rights of other human beings, then whatever you analyze, you must analyze under the precept of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, because you have an affirmative obligation to serve and to try to the best of your ability to give others their due. And if others are not receiving their due, you have an affirmative obligation to inquire and to think about, because that's a state of dhulm, that's a state of injustice. And the qaida is not just that ad-darar yuzal, that not just that harm must be removed, but there is an affirmative qaida that whatever dhulm there is, whatever injustice there is, and injustice means people are not getting their rights. There is an individual fard kifaya and fard ayn. There is an individual and collective obligation to restore the balance of adl, to restore the balance to justice, so that people are receiving their rights. So you have an affirmative obligation, not simply to say, well, this is what Allah wants, but to actually think through what is needed to remove the harm and what is needed to restore al-adl, to restore justice, and to bring an end to dhulm, to bring an end to injustice. Now, so if you are not aware of the problem, this is, I mean, it's elementary, but subhanAllah, that we even need to say it, but if you don't recognize an injustice, then you're not going to engage in the thought process of what is needed to bring an end to injustice. So if your faculties don't identify an injustice, then you will not be aware of either an individual or a collective obligation to actually end that injustice. And that is why, if you notice, in a lot of my khutab, I say the most basic and essential thing is simply awareness. Because if you cannot identify the injustice, if your consciousness is so distorted and deformed that you no longer see an injustice as an injustice, then everything collapses. So let's assume that you have the faculties to recognize an injustice. Then what sets in? Then comes the question, can I change this injustice by hand? The famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that you have an obligation to either change it by hand. If you can't, then change it with your tongue, meaning speech. And then if you can't, then at a minimum, you must will the change in your heart. That's a hadith mutawatir. Now, so after the ability to recognize an injustice, then you enter into this analysis. Can I change it by hand? Can I change it by tongue? The question of ability is relevant to the question of obligation. Because if you can change it by hand and you approach it simply by speech, then you've failed in your taklif, in your obligation. If you can change it by speech, but all you do is condemn it in your heart and not speak against it, then you failed in your taklif. Because al-awwal fal-awwal, the first obligation is to actually change it, to make a difference physically, materially. If you can't, then speech. If you can't, then by moral condemnation, silent moral condemnation. Now, notice the concept of basira itself, the concept of insight. That is why I said, because I got some correspondence about that, that is why I said in the last halaqah that real true Sufism, the Sufism that managed to spread and become the main form of Islam for centuries. I mean, it wasn't Salafi Islam that was the dominant form of Islam for centuries. It was actually Sufi Islam. 90, different parts in Islamic history, 90% of Muslims were Sufis or belonged to some Sufi order or another. The main form of Islam that spread beyond the narrow area of what we call today the Middle East was Sufi Islam and Sufi orders. And the merchants that took Islam to places like the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia were all part, and this is a history that, again, if we were not colonized, we would be investigating the relationship between Sufi orders and trade. Because Sufi orders empowered Muslim trade. The Sufi orders became, it's like belonging to a fraternity. These fraternities played a huge role in sharing information and logistics and in organizing networks for merchants and trade and so on. Truly fascinating stuff. But core to that, Sufism was never about moral surrender and moral apathy or moral non-commitment. If that was the core of Sufism, Sufism would have failed a long time ago. Because a religion without morality will always fail. It's just a matter of time before that religion, crumbles and disappears. The whole justification, intuitively, human beings know that the reason we have religion is because of its relationship to right and wrong, to ethics and morality. And if religion can't do that for us, or if religion screws up that for us, or screws it up. Why I'm saying something. Anyway, you get what I'm trying to say. If religion deforms our relationship to morality, that religion will crumble and disappear. I mean, there is I forgot the name of the author. It's a 12-volume work. Unfortunately, it's in Los Angeles. I haven't shipped it here. It's not here yet. But anyway, it's in the remaining part of my library in Los Angeles that's still there. It's a 12-volume work about the history of religion and humanity. It's a very famous work. I'm trying to remember the name of the text. It will come to me, inshallah, I hope. Anyway, but if you read through that work, you find this in constant dynamic that when religion becomes simply a means of affirming the privileges of the privileged, it very quickly becomes defied and part of what human beings rebel against. And it is then replaced by another system of belief that comes in and challenges the privileges that religion has been corrupted to affirm. So even the spread of communism, the reason communism spread and caught the revolutionary fervor that it did is that Greek or that Russian Christianity especially, but even Christianity in China, to the extent that Christianity, the Christianity that had spread in China, was a Christianity that has become thoroughly wedded to power. And the voices of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, who tried to sort of raise the alarm, and saying, if Christianity has lost its moral bearings, and and they were absolutely right. It had become very dangerous because what they feared happened. Communism overthrew that Christianity. Of course, communism then lost or proved to have a very weak moral bearings itself, and so Christianity has made a comeback in places like Russia. But anyway, the history of religion is fascinating. But the lessons we learn is that, subhanAllah, when someone like Ibn Hatan Sikandari tells you the heart of insight is knowing when you have a duty for jihad or to exercise a deliberate effort, and when are the situations where you can say, okay, I have to accept the reality and I don't have an affirmative obligation to engage with this reality to change it. When he tells you that this is the heart of Basira, he's absolutely right. And the failure, if that balance is skewed for very long, it is a threat to the system of belief that exists among people. Now, in the modern state, the state can maintain the existence of religion through the sheer power of the state. In other words, the state, because it's not like before the modern nation state, the state has a monopoly over the use of force. In the old days, the state couldn't achieve a monopoly over the use of force. As much as the state tried, it really was very difficult to achieve. And the state couldn't achieve a monopoly over the dissemination of information. And as a result, there were often religious rebellions whenever religion became a corrupting power. There would be all types of rebellions against that religion, counter-religious movements that would rebel against the religion that is protected and sustained by the state. And in pre-modern days, that would either force the religion of the state to be greatly modified, because the state, in order to maintain whatever religion it favors, would then effectively reform its own religious institutions, or sometimes, as happened with the Protestant faith, for instance, or as happened, for instance, in countries that were Sunni countries that were challenged by Shia movements, the entire, you could have a replacement of religious faith and religious precepts and religious mores. In the modern age, the nation state can artificially maintain an official religion and crush any challenges to whatever faith that the state favors. For it looks like now increasingly it's going to be in perpetuity forever, because challenging the modern state has become extremely difficult. But mind you, that doesn't mean that the state can artificially maintain the religion of the state. However, that religion can become entirely vacuous. So in other words, it officially is there. Officially, you're Sunni, you're Shia, you're Christian, you're Catholic, you're whatever. But it is a completely meaningless institutional external reality. In fact, the faith of sociologically, the faith of the people is completely different than the official religion that is maintained by the state. And that's extremely dangerous. And that is why when you go to a lot of Muslim countries, for instance, you are struck by an enormous amount of hypocrisy in religion. You know, there is an official religion, officially the state is religious, but the way people live their life, because the disparity between religious relevance and the lived reality of people has grown ever more separate and apart. Okay, I'm emphasizing this because this principle is so critical. Let's move on. Okay, so this book doesn't have the Arabic along with the English, which makes it a little bit okay. لا يكن تأخر or تأخير, it both has been reported. لا يكن تأخر or تأخير أمد العطاء مع الإلحاح في الدعاء موجبا ليأسك، فهو ضمن لك الإجابة فيما يختار لك لا فيما تختار لنفسك، وفي الوقت الذي يريد لا في الوقت الذي تريد. Okay. So the translation is straightforward enough. For convenience, I'm going to read this translation and then see. Don't let delay in getting an answer to your prayers, despite your persistent dua. I'm changing the translation found in this book. So because it says, despite your persistent appeal, it's okay. Don't let delay in getting an answer to your prayers, despite your persistent dua, drive you to despair. For God has offered, or God, for God has, what God has guaranteed to you is an answer, or that God will answer your prayers as to what God chooses for you, not what you choose for yourself. And on God's time, not your own time. So that's the basic translation. What can we say about this principle? Well, if one would choose one of the constant ways that a relationship with Allah fails, is that people would, for whatever is it that they're praying for, whatever that they sincerely and wholeheartedly are doing dua for, and quite often it is something serious, like, the health of a loved one. They don't want a loved one to pass away, or, especially if you have a sick child, for instance, and you're doing dua that Allah, cure my child. In other words, things that are quite important. Or things that, for human psychology, you are convinced is good, and you don't see any convincing reason why you shouldn't get what you are asking for, because you think either you're worthy, or you think that getting what you are asking for is good for you, and it's not bad for anyone else, etc., etc. But the persistent dua when it is not answered, and if we are just being very honest, so many people, when their dua is not answered, they feel hurt, aggrieved, even betrayed, and it weakens their faith, or makes them, at least, it's as if, even if they don't dare tell themselves that, it's as if they're angry with their maker. I prayed for and you didn't give me. Now, there's, for those who sojourn in Allah's path or to Allah, a couple of things. One, they consider dua not a form of asking, but a form of ibadah. So they say, اجعل دعاءك عبودية لا طلبا. Make your dua a form of worship, not an actual request. Dua is very important in learning to talk to God and learning to hear from God. But if you approach God with hubris or presumptuously or arrogantly, why do you think God would give you the kashf? Kashf means would open or lift the veils to allow for a personalized relation. Think in human terms. Sometimes thinking just as humans helps us. If I come to you and you get the sense that I am asking you for something, and I tell you, oh, you're my friend, I care about you, but very quickly you get the sense that I'm in this relationship that I have with you, I'm asking you for something. And if you don't give me the something, I am going to be cross with you. What happens in normal human relations? You start thinking, this is an opportunistic relationship. This is a person who is not really asking. They're being polite, saying, please, can I have X and Y or Z? But they are really demanding. They're demanding it in a couched language. And if I don't comply with the demand, then that will affect the relationship. It's not a real relationship. And either you feel like a benefactor, not a friend, not a genuine relationship, but either you feel you're generous, and so you say, okay, I don't mind, okay, I'll give it to you. Although I know, but by definition, the minute I give it to you, what will happen is what always happens with human beings all the time, is that because you approached God with greed, you received from God with greed, the minute God gives you what you want, you will start drifting away. It is inevitable. So the fervor and the passion and the heartache that used to exist as you were praying for the thing, once God gives it to you, suddenly it seems very remote, and you can hardly even remember. You might even be tempted to reinvent a little bit of history. oh, yeah, I had a heartache, but, I really got what I got because I deserve it. Or, yeah, I was so, you sort of chuckle at yourself. Yeah, I was praying so fervently for this, but, it's my hard work that got me where, whatever. Astaghfirullah. God, if human beings are not stupid, a priori, God is not stupid. God could give you what you want as a benefactor. Okay, here, take it and go. I know that you're not genuine. Just take it and go. Or God might say, you're not genuine. I'm not giving you what you want. Now, if God wants to build a relationship with you, if God, in fact, wants to encourage a relationship with you, does God deal with you as a benefactor by saying, here, take it and go? Or does God say, I'm not going to give it to you because you are approaching me opportunistically? We don't have a real relationship. So, Radd al-Dua, not having your prayer answered, can often be actually Allah calling upon you to approach Allah genuinely, not opportunistically. So it's not that Allah is actually denying you, but Allah is inviting you to rethink the way you are approaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's one. So now, Imam al-Shazli would often say, قد عجزنا عن دفع الضرر عن أنفسنا من حيث نعلم بما نعلم. That in truth, considering what we do know and what we know and how we know it, we really are not in a position to avoid harm to ourselves. So, in other words, in every prayer, in every dua, you really do not know what is harmful for you or not harmful for you. And especially if you are taking your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seriously. So something could in fact be to a great material advantage, a bigger salary, a better life, whatever, a child, a marriage. But in Allah's knowledge, what you are given in terms of your entire existence, in other words, your life in this earth and the hereafter, it is actually not good for you. It will make you, as often, getting what you pray for often becomes the very means through which you drift away from God, giving you the job, giving you the means, giving you the life, it actually translates into a weaker relationship from Allah, not a better relationship with Allah. Now, that is why they would often say, proof of answering your dua, proof of answering dua is in no way evidence of good standing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if you were sincere in a different type of dua, Allah, give me what is good for me in this life and in the hereafter. And if that was genuinely what you want, and this is your heartfelt dua, then in fact it could be that receiving the material thing that you're hoping to receive is actually neither good for you in this life or in the hereafter, or not good for you in the hereafter, or good for you in terms of a genuine relationship. Allah knows that in fact this path will take you further away from Allah, not closer to Allah. And so the knowledge of the divine and the knowledge of the human, being cognizant of this fact, it is quite often, and the awareness for a sojourner on the path, that in fact proof of Allah's love for you is not answering your prayer. So there is a report, Allahu Alam, I mean, I have not investigated its authenticity, but it is reported that Imam Ali would say that if we prayed for something and Allah gave it to us, we would be happy, a single happiness. We prayed for it, alhamdulillah, Allah gave it to us. But if Allah denied it to us, we would be happy 100-fold. That you get the point from that, is that it is often the denial could actually be a more genuine evidence of closeness to Allah and a genuine relationship with Allah than the answer, than the affirmative answer. So Shazli would often say, لا تختر شيئا لا تختاروا شيئا بل اختار Allah. So don't choose a thing, choose Allah instead, meaning that you don't choose, your will doesn't go to a material conclusion, but your will goes to whatever God chooses for you. So a sojourner on the path, and that's what a dua as a form of worship means, instead of a dua as a form of demand. My dua, Allah, is offer me this if you know it is good for me, for my hereafter before my here now. And if you know that it is good for me in my iman and my relationship with you. And ultimately, Allah, although I am praying for what I think, for something on the basis of what I know that I don't know. So ultimately, Allah, my prayer is that make my choice consistent with what you choose for me. So I know I'm forgetting something, but what is it? Oh, no. There is so much on this point. Like if you read Ihya Ulumuddin, Ghazali writes close to 100 pages on the same principle. in Qut Qulub, there are about 30 pages. So I'm just going to tell you some of just little tidbits of what you can find in these texts. So if you approach Allah sincerely with the requisite humility, Allah guarantees you a response. But if your approach is truly a ibadah and not a demand, that what Allah guarantees you is that Allah will give you on Allah's time and what Allah ultimately knows is good for you. So there are some of the there is a I'm trying to remember if it's that I forgot who said it. I can't remember who that. It might be even a hadith. Wait, hold on one second. Maybe I can find. Is it mentioned here at all? Yeah, it's not here, but it might be a hadith or a riwayah from one of the Sufi sages, but that. No, it is a hadith. It is a hadith because of the nature of the way. That whatever you pray for, and you do not receive in this here in the here now. So whatever you pray for, and if Allah knows that your dua was as we described it, in other words, your dua is a form of ibadah, more than a form of demand, where you trust in Allah. Whatever you do not receive on this earth, you are compensated for, or you are blessed for in the hereafter. So what that hadith says is that especially those that Allah kept close by not giving them what would have enriched them in the world, that they come in the hereafter. And I forgot, the end of the hadith is that that person would come in the hereafter and say, لَيْتَهُ لَمْ يَقْضِي لِي حَاجَةً فِي الدُّنْيَا. That you come and you see how those who prayed or did the dua are compensated in the hereafter for not having their dua answered in a material way. That when they come in the hereafter, they would in fact wish that God hadn't answered any of their dua. So that in fact you come at the end, in the hereafter, and you are your entire evaluation as to what you received on this earth makes it so that you actually wish that more of your dua was denied on earth, so that you would receive the reward in the hereafter. There is the other story that is often reported about the timing of the dua. Al-Ghazali mentions in the Ihya that the time for Musa alayhi salam and his brother Harun, when they did a dua, they asked God to smite the Pharaoh. People often forget, and God responds and says, قَدْ أُجِيبَتْ دَعْوَتْكُمَا, that your prayer has been answered. The time difference between dua Harun wa Musa, the dua that Allah strike down the Pharaoh, and when it actually happened is 40 years. So we often, I mean, the Quran responds, comments on dua of Musa alayhi salam and says, your prayer has been answered. But it was answered after 40 years. So being cognizant, because this is when a lot of the Arab revolutions failed, there was a blowback among a lot of the young people that were out in the demonstrations, in other words, active, in that they lost their faith. And they lost their faith because they said, well, we were doing dua that Allah strike down Sisi, or that Allah strike down Assad, or that Allah... And it didn't happen. So we lost our faith. Is that... I mean, maybe these human frailties are unavoidable, but there is, if that is your attitude, all I can say is there is no way that you are going to reach a genuine relationship with Allah. There's another interesting story. A couple of points and then we'll move on. Al-Mursi, Ibn Abbas al-Mursi, Ibn Ata al-Secondary's teacher, and a very famous figure in Egyptian history and Islamic history. He was on his deathbed, and a man, I forgot the name of the student, but anyway, the student was visiting him, and the student said, I pray that Allah gives you afiyah. And Ibn Abbas didn't respond initially. I'm trying to, I mean, if my memory serves me right, anyway. So he didn't respond initially, and the student then sort of wanted, I guess expected Ibn Abbas to express some approval of the dua, to say inshallah or ameen or something like that. So he said again, we pray that Allah gives you good health. We pray that Allah heals you. And then Ibn Abbas said, listen, recall that Umar radiallahu anhu asked Allah for afiyah, and he was assassinated. And Ali radiallahu anhu asked Allah for afiyah, and he was assassinated. And Hussein radiallahu anhu asked for Allah for afiyah, and he was killed. Afiyah is good health, well-being, right? And then he tells them, in all of that was their afiyah. In other words, your afiyah, your state of well-being is in the way Allah defines it for you, not the way you define it for yourself. Because Allah knows that it is better for them in the hereafter. It could be that they be assassinated, that they be killed, or that in fact you would continue suffering from your illness. The Sufi traditions are replete with stories of some of the most famous Sufi names suffering from long illnesses. Now, and these illnesses eventually kill them. Remember the hadith that when Allah loves someone, إذا أحب الله العبد ابتلاه, that when Allah loves someone, Allah afflicts that person with hardship. Hardship is often proof of closeness to Allah, not remoteness from Allah. If Allah knows that that you will see hardship as alienating from you from God, then indeed God will not give you hardship. But if Allah knows that hardship draws you only closer to God, then Allah will bring you closer through hardship. One final point. Often Sufis in this context cite the ayah, أَمَنْ يُجِيبَ الْمُضْطَرَ إِذَا دَعَاهُ, that who answers al-muttar. Now al-muttar normally is translated as a person who suffers, is in dire circumstance. So that Allah is saying, think of who answers your prayer when you are out of options, when you are truly in dire circumstance. In Sufi literature, they have a very different definition of al-muttar. They don't define as al-muttar as someone who is in dire circumstance or someone who is out of options. They define al-muttar as someone الذي لا يرى لنفسه عملا, is that someone, al-muttar is someone who has placed their entire trust in Allah and who, whatever their sincere will is entirely correlated to Allah's will. So, in fact, they will nothing for themselves but what Allah wills for them. And so the expression al-muttar is often used in commentaries on this qaida. But al-muttar in Sufi literature means something very specific. Is not someone who is out of options or someone who is in dire necessity, but someone who has become completely reliant on and their will is completely consistent with Allah's will. So their dua, and when they pray for, because there's a hadith that says, Is'alullah al-afiyah. There's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, pray, ask Allah for afiyah, for well-being. But in Sufi literature, when they pray for afiyah, they mean afiyah in a holistic, totalistic way. Not afiyah meaning good health. Like Ibn Abbas was the student that visited him. But afiyah means what is good for my closeness to you, Allah, what is good for my relationship to you, Allah, what is good for my here now and hereafter. And if there is conflict, then my priority always goes to the hereafter. Now, does it make a difference? Because I've been asked this before. So are you saying that if I truly can work hard so that when I pray and say, Allah, I ask you for afiyah, for goodwill, or good health, good being, let's say good being. That in fact, if I condition myself that I am actually asking Allah for what is good for me in a holistic, totalistic way, not in a materialistic way, not good health, but good being, meaning in my relationship before anything else to you, Allah. And my answer is absolutely. In fact, again, I keep getting that question all the time throughout my career, my life. How do we achieve irtiqa? How do we get closer to Allah? Well, this is one of the most necessary steps. Irtiqa, elevation, where you have a hope of, for instance, achieve maqam al-shuhud. You achieve irtiqa, elevation. To get to the maqam, to the station of shuhud, it's as if you see Allah, as if you hear Allah. Allah is no longer a theoretical, abstract construct to you. Allah is a living reality that you interact with, you experience in the most vivid way. In fact, it becomes so vivid that it becomes far more pressing than material reality. There was a doctor, I forgot what school he was in. Anyway, he was really interested in what happens to the mind because he grew up, he's Muslim, and he grew up hearing, he's Pakistani, and he grew up in Sufi community. And he would hear some of the people that he really respected say about maqam al-shuhud, that they live with God. And he wanted to understand this. So he did the study, which I found really fascinating. He wired the brains of common people, common Muslims, to Sufi sojourners. And in response to certain stimulants, saw how their brain respond. And one of the things I'll never forget is him describing to me that how the brain of a Sufi lights up in response to what he is describing as an experience with the divine, that it was completely anomalous. He was showing me, pictures and graphs and things of like parts of the brain. Of course, I don't know, he used a lot of technical language but the point was, and as far as I know, he said that he was working on publishing. So as far as I know, he published it. But anyway, because it stuck with me because one of the brains he invited, because he was chuckling about it, is somehow he convinced Deepak Chopra to sit for one of his tests. And he was telling me that the brain of Deepak Chopra lit up like the brain of a Sufi. So, I was, I'm presenting that testimony because it's what I experienced. So, of course, I can't verify any of the scientific data, but that's what he was saying. Anyway, so it just stayed with me. The point is, it's not figurative. And yes, one of the prerequisite steps, if you want to reach that, there is something jinni going on for sure. One second, I'm sorry. I was saying that if you absolutely are if you are a sojourner, if you're not a sojourner, it might be that's purely enough for you. You want to ask Allah for something, you want Allah to answer your prayer, You want to do your salah, your psalm, and that's good enough for you. And khalas, may Allah bless you. Not, sojourning, al-tariq, al-qasid is not for everyone. But if you want irtiqa, and if you want to reach the maqam al-shuhud, or any higher maqam, it is absolutely the case that you must train yourself for your will to be utterly compliant with Allah's will. And to see al-afiyah, to see goodness in whatever Allah wills. It is not that it means I'm dead or apathetic or unfeeling or unemotional. It's none of that. In fact, anyone that listens to my khutbahs or knows my writing, I feel passion all the time. But ultimately, the intimacy of my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fully understands that this entire creation is God's and not mine. And that God works on God's time and according God's will, not my time and not my will. And that is why my faith is never affected by either a victory or a defeat. It is affected by the reality of the relationship, not by the superficiality of perception. Is that clear enough? Okay. Shall we pray Maghrib and come back? Okay. So we'll break for Maghrib and continue, inshallah. Okay, well, inshallah, we won't go for much longer, but I know the principles that are coming up, inshallah, and laying of the foundation. I'm hoping that there will be some people who, whether now or later on in life, use these halaqas to actually try to achieve the irtiqa that we're talking about and go through that journey. And it's not just that it is worth it, but if you do it, it becomes it's like growing up so that it becomes the only possible thing that you could have done. You don't see any other choice. So the foundations are important, the steps are important. This is not something that in which you can skip step or do something not to its fullest extent. Okay, so principle number 7, لا يشككنك في الوعد عدم وقوع الموعود وإن تعين زمنه لئلا يكون ذلك قدحا في بصيرتك وإخمادا لنور سريرتك. Okay, so number 7, which builds a great deal on number 6, which we just talked about. You know, this book really should have numbered. Um,
Top of page 5.
okay. So, don't let the non fulfillment of a promise, even if the time of its fulfillment has been specified, make you question the promise. The translation says makes you suspicious of the promise. It's really question the promise itself. For this, for doing so may obscure your basira. Here it says it may obscure your intellect. It's not that it might obscure intellect. It might obscure your basira, your insight, the development of your powers of perception. وإخماد لنور سريرتك, and that it might extinguish your inner light, according to the translation here. But I'm going to elaborate on Nur al-Sarira, what it means, because it has a specific meaning here. Okay, so part of it is, I think, clear enough and rather obvious that if you understand something as a promise from Allah, now you might be surprised by the expression here, وَإِن تَعَيَّنَ زَمَنُهُ, that even if its time has been specified. The reason that this would surprise you is that we normally don't experience any promises with a time specified, right? The context in, remember that he's writing these texts for sojourners that actually have shuyukh. They have teachers or masters who are leading them along the way. And one of the hardest thing, and we will see this in the future, as for instance, you are instructed to go into khalwa, or that you do exercises of tajreed. One of the realities of this path is that you might find someone who goes into khalwa for a fairly short period of time, and they have an extraordinary experience. They go through something that transforms their entire life. While someone else it might take much longer. Or they go through the exercises of tajreed, or some of the other things that inshallah we'll be talking about in other principles. And these steps as we said, they start out with, they're all based, if you, in the original text, like Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyah's text, is every principle. There are numerous citations to the Quran, numerous examples that go back to the examples of the Prophet ﷺ, but so much of it starts with Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, and then through generation after generation after generation of experience. And when you read the reports of these experiences, and especially if you have a teacher that is guiding you through these steps and is saying, okay, well, now you enter this stage, now you enter this stage. One of the one of the biggest sources of failure where students become restless and lose heart is because they see things occurring for other students very quickly or much sooner, while for them it might be taking much longer or they have a more complicated path and so on. So that's the context in which he mentions وَإِن تَعَيَّنَ زَمْنُ, even if its time has been specified. But ask yourself, we often as believers, even when God doesn't specify a time for us, we will interpret God's will as one with a specified time. And especially when it comes to God's reading, for instance, the Quran and promises of victory. That if you are with God, or if you in tansurullah yansurkum, and that if you are with God, that God will give you victory and so on. Psychologically, it is the very natural and common for human beings to read this as a promise, and a promise that should be delivered within what we relate to in human time. But that simple fallacy is the reason why a lot of people find their relationship to Allah hampered. Because in order to understand Allah's time, you need to have an understanding, a genuine understanding of الصفات الإلهية, the characteristics of Allah, and a relationship with الذات الإلهية, and an actual relationship with the truth of Allah, the reality of Allah. But so it's like putting the cart before the horse. That you won't have the understanding that gives you that firm faith in patience unless you have a real relationship. But you don't have a real relationship if you don't have patience, because you despair, you become restless. And that is why it is so emphasized here and in later principles that you cannot get the order of things wrong. You cannot put the cart before the horse. That you're not going to have the type of understanding based in real faith and wisdom unless you have a relationship. But if you grow restless, the dynamics of the relationship will not come to be. So that's one thing, is that you believe in the promise, but you must know that each human being is truly an individual. And in the same way that our levels, our talents are very different, our intelligence is very different, why Allah gave you the talents that Allah gave you, or the personality traits that Allah gave you, or whatever. These are things that require a genuine relationship to even start thinking about them in a meaningful way. Because we are so different, the timeline for irtiqa is also very different. One person might need years of khalwa, another person might need days of khalwa. And one of the things that you completely put to the side, and other principles, as we will see inshallah in the future, will underscore this, is that you cannot have the path of irtiqa unless you set aside comparing yourselves to others. That game of comparison is fatal. If you are constantly saying, well, and especially as a lot of students fall into this mistake where they start comparing themselves to their teacher. So they want a mentorship, they want a guideline, so they ask their teacher, well, tell us your story. When did things happen to you? And quite often, the only example they have is from the teacher. And so if things don't manifest in their lives the way it unfolded in the story of their teacher, it becomes a cause for restlessness. And that's extremely dangerous, and that's a fallacy. One of the things you learn on this path is you don't compare notes. Your relationship to Allah is individual and unique, and no two people are alike. That's the thing, and I'll comment about this in 1 second. In law treats people as if they are replicas of one another. Law generalizes because law treats people as if they're memes, they're copies. That is why law is by definition superficial and unreal. Sunnatullah fi kawn is the uniqueness of human being. Human beings are not copies of one another. Law, because it is such a limited instrumentality, is forced to treat people like they're all copies of one another. But that is ilm al-sharia, not ilm al-haqiqa. Ilm al-haqiqa never treats people as replicas of one another. Your accountability is individual, your relationship to Allah is individual, your path of development is individual, as the individuality of the dreams that you have at night. What you experience in your dreams is unique to you. Okay. The other thing that we must, deserves, is that remember here he's using two words, al-basira was-sarira. As I said, that he says that if you doubt the promised, or if you become restless because of the timing of the promised, قطحا في بصيرتك, that this will weaken your insightfulness, your basira, وإخماد لنور سريرتك, and it will suppress the light of your sarira. And this book, as we said, it translated sarira as your inner light. It will extinguish your inner light. Okay. Al-Basira, which we've translated as insight, in this field is always defined as al-quwwa al-muhayya'ah li-idrak al-ma'ani. Al-Basira is your capability, your ability to comprehend, to receive and comprehend meanings. And it is like the closest thing to it in English is perception. So you perceive things, you absorb things, you digest things, you analyze things through that perception. As-sarira, what has been translated here as inner light. As-sarira is, they always say, describe it as al-quwwa al-musta'idda litamakkun al-ilm wal-ma'rifah. That as-sarira is this inner faculty within you that in which truisms, in which foundations about what you consider to be a truth in life is established. So, for instance, your basira, your insight, is where this perception part of you that will be receiving experiences, let's say about your mother, and interpreting your experiences with your mother or with your father or with your wife or with your husband. And it sifts through, this experience means this experience means that, this experience means this. And it's not just experiences, but it is also what you expect of them. So my expectation is based on this and this. And so you are constantly sifting through and categorizing through your basira. You're categorizing perceptions, experiences, not just raw data, but experiences. Your sarira, now, what you come to perceive as the meaning of motherhood, that's in your sarira, in your inner core. Or what you come to define as fatherhood. Yes, it went through your basira, but it settled in your sarira. So it has become your core assumptions about things, right? So now, so these assumptions, whether you see God as your perceptions are sifting through your experiences with God. What settles in your sarira is the fundamental assumptions about how you understand God, nearly what you come to associate with godness. So how you relate to the concept of God's mercy, that's settled in your sarira. It might have gone through a lot of your basira initially, but it becomes filtered and settled eventually in your sarira. And so, what God's mercy means to you, what God's compassion means to you, what God's forgiveness means to you, what God's vengeance means to you, what God's justice means to you. Whether for better or for worse, it's not necessarily negative or positive, because it could very well be, distorted or wrong or whatever. So now, Sufis often talk about basira, sarira, and sir. Sir translates literally into the secret. But sir is a concept that we'll talk about it more, because it will come up more and more and more and more as we go in this journey. But sir is it's a deeply philosophical concept. Sir is, put it this way, your basira eventually defines your sarira. Your basira and your sarira, or put differently, your nafs and your aql and your rawh. Your nafs is your consciousness, your rawh, your aql is your intellect, and your rawh is your spirit. All of these become your sir. Now, literally it means secret, but what in this context it really means who quintessentially you are as a human being. Now, there is a big debate about whether a sheikh can ever actually comprehend the sir of their students, quintessentially who their students are. That's a big debate, because the sir is known only to Allah. Now, whether the only possible exception that some Sufi opinions admit other than Allah is a very insightful, perceptive sheikh. But beyond the sheikh and Allah, the sir is not accessible to anyone else. Most often, not even you. Most people, even if they have insights in their basira and maybe insights in their sarira, maybe, the vast majority of people will not get beyond that and will not understand what the core of their being is. If the path of irtiqa, the sirr al-ilahi, and the sirr al-insani, the most beautiful and spectacular and luminous thing happens when they meet. But we'll talk about that, inshallah, much later. However, so the part that I want to make sure, though, I maybe we'll have to comment more about it in next halaqah, inshallah, but let's see. Okay, so your tasami, the level of your elevation in irtiqa terms, how elevated spiritually you are, relies on your madarik. Madarik are your sensories, the sensory experiences. So madarik is even more primitive than the basira, obviously far more primitive than the sarira, and it is basically the instruments of what. So, but they say more about the madarik. So they talk about madarik al-shahawat. Madarik al-shahawat means the way that you experience and absorb, the way that you experience desire. And madarik al-ahkam al-shar'iyya, the way that you experience law. And madarik al-tajalliyat wal-waridat, and the way that you experience spiritual illuminations. So the way that you experience desire, the way that you experience law, and the way that you experience spiritual illumination. Now, there is one final madrak, which is level 4, but I'll get to it in a second. Now, madarik al-shahwat, the way you experience desire goes, what they say, through an-nafs. An-nafs is your consciousness. everything that creates your consciousness, your eyes, your skin that you experience things from, your mouth, your nose, your ears, the the way that your intellect tells you to feel sensations. So desires go through the sensations. The law, مدارك الشرعية, the way that you are supposed to experience law is through مدرك العقل, through the intellect, which is very interesting. So what do you do with the people that don't even experience the law through the intellect, but experience the law through sensory perception or sensory feelings? They can't even reason through the law. But anyway, then مدارك التجليات والإرادات, where you experience the illuminations, they say that that مدرك التجليات والواردات الروح, that is experienced by your spirit. Okay. Now, مدارك, what they say as مدارك التحقيقات. Now, where you experience true certainty, real certitudes about life, is in your sir. That's where your sir is. So again, desires are your sensations, your nafs. Law is through your intellect, al-aql. The illuminations of the divine is through the rawh, the spirit. What ultimately settles as your certitudes of life is in the core of your being, in your sir. So again, as we said, that what really settles into what type of, what is your nature as a human being. Now, so why is all of this relevant? Because what they're telling you is that if you start upon the path of experiencing a thing through the wrong path, it will ultimately result in an imbalance and in a failure of taraqqi. So how so? So let's say I approach God with, God, I want to experience you. So I want to experience you through my rawh, through my spirit, and I want to experience you through my spirit by having illuminations, tajalliyat, and ultimately I want you to enter into the core of my being, into my sir. I want my sir to be you. But I sit and I'm approaching God intellectually, the way I think about law. Okay, God, I've done 1,000 tasbih, I've done 1,000 tahmid, I've been fasting for, 2 days a week. I have now been doing dhikr for half an hour. Oh, now it's an hour. And my intellect is now, you're not, what your intellect is blocking your spirit. So you will not have any illuminations. You will not have any tajalliyat. You are approaching God in this because you are dealing with, you're haggling with God through the faculty of the intellect. Even worse, if you are haggling with God through desire. How so? I want to have an experience Allah because I want to feel special among my friends. I want to be able to go to my friends and say, I dreamt of the Prophet and the Prophet hugged me and kissed me and I saw a light and I levitated over I was praying and I levitated in the air and and I'm thinking about how cool it would be that I'm going to tell my friends about it. It will never happen. It will never happen. Desire is through your sensory being. If your goal is to impress a woman, let's say, this woman, if she knows that I'm so close to Allah, she'll agree to marry me. It will never happen. It is only when you put the desire aside and the intellect aside and approach Allah through your spirit, the tajalliyat will happen. And with the tajalliyat, then your sir, the core of your being, will open up and receive the divine. And you will experience the beauty of the divine in ways that defy the descriptions of language and the powers of the intellect. I see that we've lost all the people or most of the people online, so I think that's quite enough for tonight. And I'm sorry for, it was too long, but they're two very, very important principles. Just keep in mind, if we were doing this in the way that it's done in those who are actually belong to a tariqah for irtiqa, each principle is not, we focus on and we talk about for 6 hours, 8 hours, and then we have exercises to master the principle. So you actually go at a very slow pace. But at least it's all recorded and preserved for whoever might come along in history and try to walk the path. Okay, thank you guys. Thank you for sticking with me, and come close the proceedings.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much again, as always. This has been, I know you feel like self-conscious that maybe it's too long or that we didn't cover many because we only covered 2 wisdoms, but it's so valuable, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that I thought were so important. All of it is so important, and not the least of which for helping us to understand like the context that we live in and what we encounter when we are, with other Muslims. And even from the very beginning, when you were explaining, like when people ask you questions about, Islam and Islamic law, and tell me why Islamic law says this, that, or the other thing, and comparing how, someone might ask a question about Jewish law. I think it makes it very clear, we know people who have, that feeling when someone is like too embarrassed to ask because it's like, I'm so ignorant, I don't know enough, I don't even know how to formulate this question, versus people who come in and say, they expect you to answer, very specific questions, and the attitude, it's so clear. And I think the fact that you pointed out that this is, really a sign, a telltale sign of how we are, colonized faith and the attitude. I mean, that's extremely valuable to understand. And that, faith being contingent on someone's understanding of law and history as opposed to a relationship with God. You covered so much, but these are the things that really stood out to me. The heart of insight, or the heart of Basira, is understanding the difference between, what Allah has given us, maybe in terms of our situation, in terms of our, our wealth or our blessings, versus what is truly our responsibility and our duty. And the first part of that is just awareness, understanding dua as worship as opposed to asking for something specifically. And I know I learned from you and also from your mom, from Mama so long ago, that, probably one of the best dua is just always asking for whatever is best and understanding that you don't know what that is, but Allah does. And that, that in some ways makes life so simple because you never really ask for anything other than whatever is best. And then understanding that everything is on Allah's time, and the very interesting point about the people during the Arab Spring losing faith because they were expecting that all of their dua would get answered in that time, and losing faith when it wasn't answered. But the point about, how it took Moses and Aaron's dua 40 years before it was answered, puts really things into perspective. And understanding that Allah's time, in order to understand Allah's time, you really need to understand the characteristics of Allah and truly have a relationship with the reality or the truth of Allah. And then understanding that every individual or every person has a very unique and individual relationship with Allah, and their path to elevation is unique. And even that your individual dreams are unique. When you put it that way, that everyone has, I guess it, but when you hear it, it's like your dreams are unique to you. That really brings things home. And then the last bit of the discussion about how when people are trying to reach God or elevation through the wrong mechanism, so, whether it's through desire or intellect, you're trying to reach the divine, that's a mismatch. So understanding just these things at that level is so valuable, and I'm so excited to see what you will continue to develop and present, inshallah, in next week's time. So two wisdoms, but they were so rich and so important, and the foundational discussion before was really priceless. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being with us, and I look forward to...
The only two people.
Yeah, it's okay, doesn't matter. We have a lot of people that... Well, actually, they jump on and they watch over time. So, the most important thing was really to preserve this knowledge. And, it goes out there. It's, when people need it and are looking for it, that it's there for them to find, because it's so valuable. We just don't hear it anywhere else. And, even when you compare what's covered in the book versus what you discuss and the richness that you bring to it, you see the value in this, this discussion. So... Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And inshallah, I hope to see you next week.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for staying up so late.
I miss both of you.
I know. Assalamu alaikum.
Can they hear me?
I think so. Yeah, Joe looks like he's still...